Do you need Susan to turn off her video to move over?
We're in the main room. I think
Oh,
we're all
okay.
set, so we can get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Please note that today's call will be recorded, and in order to maintain focus on our speakers, all participants' microphones and video cameras have been turned off. We have reserved some time at the end of the program for questions from the audience. If you're joining us today from a computer, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your question at any time. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andrew Balsam, a member of ADL New Jersey Advisory Board, to offer some opening remarks.
Thank you, Nora. On behalf of ADL's Northeast Division, which includes our offices in Connecticut and New England, as well as the New York, New Jersey region, which I'm actively involved in, I welcome you all to this webinar. I hope that everyone is well and that you and your families continue to stay safe and healthy. Since its founding in 1913, ADL has been fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate and bigotry. And now ADL is at the forefront of addressing how social media has been misused to spread hate, misinformation, and extremism online, and recruit others to join in extremist causes. January 6th was not a revelation, but a culmination. After years of disinformation, conspiracy theories, hate, and abuse that have festered online, mainly on social media platforms. It's easy to forget that if Facebook was a person, it would only be getting its driver's license. Twitter would be a freshman in high school, and services like Gab and Parler would barely be in elementary school. While the social media industry is still relatively young, its impact is felt every day in both positive and harmful ways. One of the most significant questions of the next decade will be how to harness social media to ensure its benefits are not outweighed by its costs to society. In light of events like January 6th, it is more important than ever to be having discussions about the dangers posed by social media to society and ways to prevent extremism, abuse, and hate from taking over platforms. With that said, I'm very excited to welcome everyone to this panel discussion and dive deeper into this important topic. I would like to now welcome Stephen Ginsberg, Regional Director of ADL's Connecticut office, to introduce our moderator and panelists. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks for your leadership and for getting us rolling and for providing a great context for today's program. So I've got the privilege of introducing a really stellar group of experts, and I'm just going to get right to it so we can start to hear from them as soon as possible and have hopefully a rich conversation and get some great questions and learn a lot. Our first panelist today is Susan Benesch. Susan founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Project to study speech that can inspire violence and to find ways to prevent it without infringing on freedom of expression. She was a journalist for years, mainly in Latin America and Haiti, and then became a human rights lawyer. Susan teaches at American University and is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Next, we've got Graeme Wood, someone I reached out to years ago in New Haven, and he and I and a colleague had coffee, and we've been in touch ever since, and I'm really glad that he's here with us to join ADL for this program. Graeme's a staff writer at The Atlantic, which he joined in 2006. He's the author of The Way of Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State, and was the 2015-2016 Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He teaches political science at Yale University. We've also got my colleague, Lauren Krapf. Oren works with us here at ADL as counsel for our technology policy and advocacy work. In this capacity, she oversees ADL's policy initiatives to decrease online hate, and her work across the country includes legislative and advocacy efforts supporting targets of online harassment and holding social media companies accountable for their role in fomenting extremism, hate, and racism, both online and on the ground. And our moderator today is my friend Oren Segal, our Vice President at ADL's Center on Extremism, where he and his team combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, Oren and the center provide resources, expertise, and training which enable law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. Now I'm thrilled to pass the mic to Oren to get our conversation started. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. Appreciate the intro, and thank you, Andrew, for stepping up as well. And really, thank you all for making the time to join this webinar. As many of you know, ADL does not dabble in light topics per se, but we also know that these are really, really critical topics that we're dealing with. I know it's the top of mind for a lot of people. I think there was someone just mentioned one of the headlines in the New York Times today. It read, a global tipping point for reining in tech has arrived, right? So almost every single day, leading the news, impacting probably our families, our communities, are issues related not only to sort of the online infrastructure, but the way that it is exploited by some. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to look at some of these issues regarding the proliferation of hate and extremism, harmful speech, the impact on our community, because it's really critical that people develop a better understanding of this in order to figure out ways to mitigate and push back. And so I can't think of a better group of people and panelists to help us understand this issue. Both Susan, Lauren, and Graeme, I think, are going to provide insights that will help sort of explain the issues, what we need to know about it, and also perhaps some solutions or what we need to be mindful of as we move forward. So I'm just going to get right in and just start asking some questions. We will make time at the end, I think 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience, and we'll instruct folks on how to get those questions in. But I'd like to start with Graeme. Thankfully, you made it, Graeme, last minute. We appreciate that. I think it's probably hard to believe, but some people don't have a sense of, what does hate and extremism in the online spaces look like, or they're only starting to sort of understand these issues. A lot of the reporting that you've done on sort of ISIS networks online, and even more recently, looking at the videos that Kyle Rittenhouse, the Kenosha shooter, was looking into, and how that sort of atmosphere impacted perhaps what he did on the ground. Can you help us set the stage with what does extremism look like, and how can that content motivate people to action on the ground based on what you've seen?
Yes, Oren, thanks very much. Sorry, I was a bit late, some technical difficulties, but the advantage to being late is if there was an embarrassing introduction, then I didn't have to hear it. So I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for asking me to talk about this. Much of my introduction to online hate and extremism was through ISIS. I was writing about ISIS during the height of what ISIS was doing, and that, for I think a lot of people, was the moment when you saw things that were happening online. That is the creation of communities of hate, really turning into some kind of action that was not just undeniable in individual cases, but in entire communities. That is the creation of a state, the creation of a state-like entity that existed in large part because there had been some prior thing that had turned through a process of activation from just an online thing to something much more serious. Now, what I think what we're finding now is, although there was a long history of new technologies being used to create ideologies of hate, to disseminate ideologies of hate, maybe a new space in turning those into action. So, and also maybe a more pervasive usage of those technologies. So one that in the jihadist space that long predated social media, and a very famous case is in pre-revolutionary Iran, the ideology of hate that was surrounding Imam Khomeini when he was in exile was largely disseminated through cassette tapes. And if we were having this discussion on the 1978 equivalent of Zoom, we would be talking about these cassette tapes and how there was no way of controlling these vile, angry, violent cassette tapes that were being handed around in the last days of the Shah's Iran. So what I think we need to think about now is, all right, what does online space do today in taking that kind of technology, making the communities that much more intense, and then also, I think there's also a change in the pervasiveness of that in the members of those communities' lives. That is, the amount of time that you spend listening to a cassette tape is going to be less than the amount of time that you spend immersing yourself in the type of violent extremist community that you might find today or in the last 5 years, now that social media exists. So you see, you mentioned Kyle Rittenhouse. We don't know that much yet about what the ideological space that he was occupying. We certainly know the ideological space that has adopted him as a mascot since the Kenosha shooting. But you find lots of people who are like him, who they are, the term is often used, cosplay. This is in Japanese subculture of costume playing, where you dress up in tactical kit, and you live in your mind as a character in this new kind of world. So, as I think anybody who spends all too much time on social media knows, there are many such worlds. Some of them are worlds that are vile, that are hate-filled, and the share of our time that these can consume has a way of now converting itself into reality in a way that I think didn't exist in as easy a form before.
Yeah, thank you for that, Graeme. And Susan, if I could turn to you, there is these ecosystems or these online spaces in which, whether it was ISIS or whether it's white supremacists or other people coalescing around an ideology that share, vile, as Graeme said, or disgusting type of commentary, hate. You've distinguished, though, between, what is hate speech and also what is dangerous speech. And can you talk a bit about what that distinction is, why it's important, and how it informs sort of our understanding of these spaces?
Yes, I am happy to do that. I'd like to start by saying thank you for including me in this webinar. I'm honored and delighted to take part, given both the other participants and the audience. And I'd like to first build just a little bit on I think some tremendously important things that Graeme said. This way in which online life can feel like reality, as a cassette tape can't, is also conceptualized as a conflating of public and private life. In other words, you are, when you're online, participating often in a community. That word is misused in so many cases, including by Facebook, which refers to its more than 2 billion users as a community. But unfortunately, there are communities forming constantly of haters who are, after all, often very far apart, physically far apart from each other. They've never met. But there is this peculiar, and in this case, insidious feeling of being together, of being almost in a private space and a private situation, which I think is very important to note when we will discuss further in our conversation what can be done about these things. You asked, Oren, about hate speech and dangerous speech. There are two critically important facts about what we loosely call hate speech that it's very important to bear in mind, I think. One of them is that hatred is not innate. It has to be taught. No baby is born hating another group of people. So it's worth learning as much as we can about how that teaching and learning happen, and of course, how to disrupt them safely. The second critical fact that is almost always, I think, overlooked, is that the effect of hate speech or its cousins, like what is sometimes called toxic speech or extreme speech, the effect is always cumulative. It happens, as Goebbels pointed out about propaganda famously, by dint of repetition. People are gradually affected more and more over time. So the susceptibility of a person to a particular message often depends on how many times that person has heard a similar message before, which brings us back to this way in which the internet can immerse people in a constant, or at least a very pervasive, hours-long, everyday experience of being exposed to terrible messages. Dangerous speech is a term that I coined and a concept that I cooked up about 10 years ago. That allows us to account for this cumulative effect of hateful or fear-inducing messages. I coined the term after looking at many examples of the kinds of language that malevolent leaders use and have used in the months and years before outbreaks of intergroup violence. And I was absolutely struck at how similar it is from case to case, from country to country, from language to language, from culture to culture, even from one historical period to another. It is absolutely uncanny. It's as if there's a school for these people somewhere, some secret school, and they take them and they teach them how to do this. And so they all use these same rhetorical techniques. That made me think that maybe such language is not only a prerequisite, not only a precursor of intergroup violence and extremist violence, but also perhaps a prerequisite. And then there might be some great opportunities for prevention presented by this, by learning about dangerous speech. And of course, now my colleagues and I at the Dangerous Speech Project have done a lot of work to try to understand it and to identify it. We think it is at least a useful kind of canary in the coal mine.
Thank you, Susan. And you know, part of what you've heard from Susan and Graeme is sort of the content in these online spaces that reinforce this hatred. We also know that many of these online spaces actually become tools for some of those who want to exploit them as well. So Lauren, can you talk a little bit about sort of the difference between the content and sometimes the conduct that is online, and how these tools are used sometimes in furtherance of harassment efforts, tools that, or the type of harassment that wouldn't have been available had those tools not been there?
Absolutely, Oren, thank you. I think first, just hearing Graeme and Susan set up this space, it's clear, and I was going to say this as well, that we're living in a world where what happens online and offline are so interconnected. And whether that's violent extremism or hate or harassment, or even just living our lives in the way of going to work on a screen or going to an event on a screen. I think that fluidity not only, and I will get to your question about conduct, but it also just reframes how we see what we're doing online versus what we're saying online. So what I'll talk about first is the fact that there's definitely content, as was mentioned, and conduct online. And just because something shows up digitally does not necessarily mean it is speech alone. So when you talk about harassment, like you mentioned, if an individual contacts someone else, one person contacts another, every single day, 20 times a day, it doesn't necessarily matter what they're saying. The fact that they're doing that is engaging in some sort of repetitive conduct. Now, if they're saying something threatening, if they're saying something hateful or harassing, that combination can certainly increase the impact on any sort of victim or target. But we're trying at ADL to really parse out the different ways that individuals act online or conspire online, as you mentioned, because they're using the resources that social media platforms or other digital tools are affording them. And so in order to better understand what we're doing online and what others are doing online and what becomes dangerous or violent on the ground, it's important to really be critical of what is speech and what is conduct. I will note, though, that we have very, very little direction from a legal standpoint and from a constitutional jurisprudence standpoint about what it means to threaten someone online or what it means to engage in speech that crosses the line. And I know that Susan and Graeme and I will probably talk about that a little bit more later. But, ADL put out our recent online hate and harassment survey. 27% of individuals experienced severe harassment, and that's sexual harassment, threats, stalking, doxing, swatting, which are newer forms of digital abuse. So we're really not just talking about speech, we're talking about the way in which individuals interact, and when they're targeting someone else, it's a problem. And our research shows that 1 in 3 individuals report that they experienced harassment they believe was tied to their identity. And so that makes it an ADL issue as well.
Thanks, Lauren. So I think many times when folks are hearing about some of the terrible things that are happening online, whether it's the sort of exploitation of the tools that are there, or whether it's just the content that we know leads to action, there's a question of like, why is this even allowed? And the question is, aren't these speech issues? Shouldn't we shut them down? And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about sort of the idea of, is this free speech, and what are the limits in terms of what folks are able to say. And I think it changes from country to country. I think we should focus in the US. And if I just start with Susan on this, and then we'll go around, can you sort of define what is the role of free speech in this conversation? Should people view what is happening in an online context as a right? Or is it more complicated because these are companies that actually can decide what they will and will not allow on their platform? Just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry about that. People refer to the First Amendment constantly regarding online speech, and especially regulation by companies. And as you indirectly suggested, Oren, the First Amendment protects Americans, and of course, not anybody else in the world. About 80% of the users of most online platforms, although they are based in the United States, are outside the United States. So that's the first thing to bear in mind, including, of course, many, when Graeme was writing about ISIS, lots of members of ISIS, the majority were outside the United States. Secondly, even in the United States, the First Amendment protects Americans against improper infringement on their freedom of expression by the government. It does not constrain Facebook or other. I use Facebook as a quick shorthand for social media companies. Social media companies are private companies running. Again, there's a very strange conflation or elision of private and public here, because Twitter particularly isn't really private, doesn't feel private, but it is operated by a private company that makes its own rules for what is and is not permitted on that platform. And Twitter and Facebook and the other platforms are entirely legally entitled to do that. They could conceivably decide that, for example, all women are banned. They won't, since that won't improve their profit margins. But legally, they are completely entitled to do that. So, where the lines should be drawn between freedom of expression and trying in various ways to limit harm brought about by online content is a conversation that is constantly going on within the companies, and to some extent between people at the companies and outsiders like me.
And in some ways, I think some of these companies that are forming some of these more niche platforms are presenting themselves as these bastions of free speech, especially in response to some deplatforming that occurs on some of the mainstream sites, and in a way sort of inviting those who might use the platform to, more easily without consequences spread their hatred. I mean, Graeme, can you talk a little bit about how these platforms sort of prop themselves up and how that sort of is helpful or useful to those extremists or those who want to promote these hateful ideas?
Yeah, Susan couldn't have said it better about the interaction of law and the platforms. Now, I think there's something to be said about the practicalities too. So there are two types of bastions. There's one where you find platforms that say they exist for the platforming of speech that Facebook or Twitter or some of the very big social media companies won't permit. So Parler might be an example of that, which sort of existed as a way for not just the violent alt-right to do its social media thing, but definitely for voices that wouldn't have been allowed to persist on Facebook and social media. And then there's other bastions of free speech that are just bastions of free speech. I mean, they are indifferent and to who is using them. So these include a kind of crypto libertarian side where they are simply saying we offer encryption and it is a tool that anyone can use. In the case, I am again going to go back to the jihadist example, because we saw a clear evolution that happened in that space, where originally you'd find people posting on Twitter. And as a journalist, this was awesome, by the way, because suddenly all these jihadists who were interacting in secret were interacting in the open, and you could just watch and see what they were saying to each other as if you weren't there. So then Twitter gets rid of them, Facebook gets rid of them, the big social media get rid of them. It's not as if, though, that there was a company that then sprung up and said, we want to be the jihadist social media company. Instead, there were entities that in some cases were just so small that they couldn't reasonably be asked to patrol their space the way that Facebook can. Facebook is, has thousands and thousands of employees, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda would post on a company called Just Paste It, which I believe at its height was run by a Polish graduate student working half-time in his basement. So of course, a company that has the resources of Facebook or Twitter will have a better chance of patrolling its platform than whoever that guy was. So you might think that, all right, so this means you just can't control it anymore. If you have both platforms that exist for the platforming of what other platforms in their private judgment describe as hate or extremist speech, and you also have platforms that simply couldn't do it or are indifferent to the speech, then that's the end of the game. That means that extreme speech online will simply always exist. It didn't actually work out that way in the case of jihadists, though. That is, once people got shooed away from Twitter, kicked off Facebook, every time that happened, there was a palpable diminishment in the ability of this information to get to the next platform. Each one of those platforms was harder to use than the previous one, and the audience was more than decimated each time. So I think in the end, that story was a heartening one, in that in the end the mass audience for it diminished, but there was a hardy, smaller audience, unfortunately, of probably the people we were most concerned about, who persisted.
Mm. Yeah, I know that's a discussion even with the sort of domestic extremists or right-wing extremists about when you push them, deplatform them, are they pushed into more sort of concentrated echo chambers? Is that actually more dangerous? We have found, like with right-wing extremists, that I think maybe there's more of a diversity of new platforms that they're migrating to. So I don't think it's sort of had the same impact as it may have had on ISIS, only because the nature of the opportunities is different. I see that you have a raise your hand, Susan, so I want to call on you and then quickly get to Lauren as well. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think since we are aiming towards, what can be done about all of this, it's useful to point out also that when extremists are online, they are talking to, we could say generally three different groups. One is each other. And when they're doing that, it can be quite useful, as Graeme said, to be able to watch. It's useful for journalists. It's useful for law enforcement. It's useful for those of us who study them and try to get in their way. It's useful for the platforms, of course, to be able to find them and kick them off. And again, this feeling that they have of being in a private space often makes them blurt out tremendous detail that they would never speak if they were in a room and some of us walked in. This is one of the peculiarities of the internet. For example, after Donald Trump tweeted in December, I think it was December 16th, his invitation to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And he used the words, "It will be wild," which after all is not an explicit call to violence. It's not even a prediction of violence in so many words. But instantly, thousands of his followers on an online forum that had previously been a subreddit, in fact, and then got kicked off of Reddit and reconstituted itself, as Graeme has been describing. Thousands of people responded immediately to that tweet and said, "Okay, we have marching orders now. I'm bringing my guns. What about you?" And then they described in gruesome detail their plans to break into the US Capitol and do terrible things to some of the legislators inside. It was absolutely not a secret. This was more than 2 weeks before January 6th. So you can see that there are some great opportunities in this open communication. The second two groups they're speaking to in various circumstances are people they would like to incite and radicalize to join them. And for that, they often use what I call dangerous speech. So that's an indirect pathway to violence. It is talking to one group of people, trying to convince them to commit or condone violence against another group of people. And the third group they're often aiming at are the people they want to frighten and terrorize. So if they post anti-Semitic content, for example, it can be with two completely different goals. One is to inspire people to be more anti-Semitic and commit anti-Semitic violence, and the other is to terrify Jews. So those are very different harmful effects, and you'd want to proceed very differently to try to suppress those. Thank you. I'll pass to Lauren gratefully.
So Lauren, I think what would be helpful too is just, again, as people are trying to wrap their minds around what is the responsibility of the platforms, what is the responsibility of government to enforce certain rules on these platforms. The term Section 230 comes up often, and I'm going to ask you to do something that is nearly impossible, but are you able to sort of crystallize what the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is, and sort of the role in that in this sort of ecosystem that we're trying to understand, and do it, in 140 or 280 characters or less.
Perfect. That's an easy ask, Lauren. I appreciate it. And I'll also invite my other co-panelists to join in after, because it's such a dynamic conversation to the extent we have time, and can all do it in 280 characters or less. But essentially, the reason why Section 230, which is a law that was passed in 1996, is brought up so frequently, is there's two reasons why. First is, well, let me back up for a second. Susan so eloquently spoke about the First Amendment and the right to speech and where and how the First Amendment applies, and the fact that private companies like Facebook and Twitter can create their own rules and community guidelines for the content that's posted on their platforms. So while the government can't restrict speech, the platforms can. But the double whammy here is that a law that was passed in 1996, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, at the dawn of the internet, Andrew mentioned how old all of the platforms might be now, freshmen in high school or in college. This law provided an immunity from liability for nearly all, there's some exceptions, but for nearly all state and federal lawsuits related to content posted on internet websites called interactive computer services. And so what this means is, regardless of what someone is saying on the platform, again, there are a couple of small exceptions, but I won't get into them because I only have a couple characters. A platform can't be held liable for the conduct or speech or behavior of individuals using such a platform. And the law was passed for good reason. There were two conflicting defamation cases pre-1996. One where a platform kept the speech up, and so this defamation stayed on the platform and remained there and causing harm to the individual. The second, where the platform took down speech. When the speech stayed up, the platform had no liability, no responsibility legally. But the platform that took the speech down, then, per case law, was held to be responsible for all of the speech on a platform. Now, let's go from 1996 to 2021. The internet looks incredibly different. There are dynamic websites. Graeme mentioned the resourcing of the Facebooks of the world, and also the emerging platforms that also very quickly get resourcing, and then smaller platforms that don't. Well, this immunity from liability, this essentially hands up, don't have any responsibility for what goes on from users, still applies regardless of the oversight, insight, or amplification or recommendations of that content to individual users. Now, it's an incredibly important law because it also allows for emerging content. It allows for us to organize. It allows for platforms to not overcorrect for fear that they might be liable. So we're really walking this tightrope of there's a limited amount of ability to hold platforms accountable. For example, there was a call to arms event on Facebook in 2020, shortly after they created a stronger community guideline against such types of events. It was flagged 450 times by moderators, or two moderators rather, and then determined to not be violative. Well, that call to arms event was filled with a lot of incitement, which we can also dig into speech a little bit more later. And in Kenosha, Wisconsin, we know what happened on the ground. We don't know from a legal perspective what, if at all, would happen if Facebook were not a platform, but instead perhaps some other host. But we know that there's no liability or responsibility there. And at the same time, how important is it to be able to communicate online, to attend educational facility, to attend educational content online, to be able to socialize online without having platforms lean in and decide what you do say or don't say, because this liability provides that protection so they can create that space for users. So this is a debate going on. How do we hold platforms accountable meaningfully? When do we not? Because we realize that the value that the platforms bring is so important. So I think that was more than 280 characters, but I did my best.
No, very good, Lauren. Thank you for that. And Graeme, I see that you, I think you wanted to respond.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lauren. I'm not an expert on the law of this, but thinking as a matter of policy, one of my colleagues, David Frum at The Atlantic, put it this way: if this were a fast food joint, not Facebook, and it said, 1 out of every 1,000 of our burgers is going to be poisonous, then we'd of course say, of course there should be regulation. I've been on Facebook recently. It's more than 1 out of every 1,000 of those posts are poisonous. So in that sense, I'm sympathetic to the idea that maybe there should be more regulation of a platform like Facebook. But in a much broader sense, I'm an American. I think the First Amendment is a great thing, and I also think that just unfettered discussion is far more valuable than most people even give it credit for. What I think this eventually ends with, though, is we should have a sense of personal responsibility for this in the following sense. We're still in a moment, even though Facebook's over a decade old, where people don't fully understand how unreliable it is. And I think as time will go by, we will individually get better at that, and that will be our responsibility. That is, if there were a hamburger joint that did poison every 1,000th burger, then people would eat at it less, or they would look much more carefully at their burger when they got it. And that's the end point that we'll probably have to get to, is a point where people just understand that Facebook is going to be a cesspool, a graffiti on the bathroom wall kind of place to get information. Maybe some interesting information, maybe some unreliable, maybe some poisonous. So I think that that kind of individual civic education is probably where this can finally land without violating our sense of freedom of speech and so forth.
So it's an interesting point about the hamburger. I almost view it as people being fed veggie burgers and being told that it's hamburgers, and they don't often know the difference. So, but that's probably an analogy for another time. Before we take some questions, I did want to ask Susan about Facebook's oversight board is expected to rule in the coming week or so, maybe, about whether to uphold Trump's suspension from the platform, which they suspended him after January 6th, sort of saying that they were concerned that he was going to maybe incite some more violence. Can you tell us a bit about sort of where you see this decision, however it lands, what that portends for sort of social media taking responsibility? It just sort of encapsulates, I think, this larger discussion well, what you think the importance of that is going to be.
I'm happy to comment on that, as long as you let me say something about burgers as a vegetarian. I think some people will stop eating burgers, metaphorically. And in fact, there are some very interesting proposals. Ethan Zuckerman, a professor at UMass Amherst, previously at MIT, has been doing some extremely interesting work on trying to build a kind of NPR version of social media, public and therefore publicly regulated online ecosystem. It's clearly not going to happen tomorrow, but I think to work on these issues really effectively, we have to think, as you do when you're working on any big problem, short, medium, and long term. Now about Facebook's oversight board, first of all, that is a very different thing, in the sense that Facebook, after getting pestered for many years about its unbelievable amount and degree of power over human communication. As I've written, Facebook is operating the largest system of censorship that the world has ever known. It's bigger than that any government operates now or has ever operated, including the Chinese government, which is saying a lot. They take down millions of pieces of content every day, and there is no oversight in that on that process, and also very little and only sort of sporadic contribution by outsiders into the making and constant remaking of the rules that Facebook calls community standards, I think, or community guidelines. So about a year ago, Facebook created this new body called the Oversight Board. It is a group of experts, mostly lawyers, which has of course been a critique. I say this as a lawyer. Again, so many darn lawyers. But in any case, it's lots of experienced and thoughtful people from many parts of the world, to whom Facebook is now referring its own decisions to take down a specific piece of content or an account. It's decided just a handful of cases so far. And we're now awaiting the case that will of course be the most notorious one in its early, sort of jurisprudence. And that's Facebook's decision on January 7th to take down Donald Trump's account indefinitely. It's interesting. Facebook and Twitter took him down. So did virtually every other platform. But that was an abrupt decision, and in my view, it was quite a failed example of content moderation, in the sense that they took Trump down. Facebook took Trump down for violating its rule against inciting violence. Why would you have a rule against inciting violence? Because you'd like to prevent the violence, obviously. And in this case, Facebook defined inciting violence exclusively in the rearview mirror. They waited until the violence happened, and then they said, oh, this guy's been inciting violence, we have to take him down. They did it abruptly and again indefinitely, which was one sign that, of course, this decision was not an outcome of a careful policy discussion. So really, Facebook has asked the oversight board now to do that careful thinking and have that discussion and come back with a recommendation whether Trump should remain banned from the platform or whether they'll reinstate him. And very importantly, in my view, Facebook has also asked for advice on what to do in future cases. After all, Trump occupied a great deal of Facebook's attention and that of the rest of us for a long time, but he is now taking up less time and attention offline and also online. The ban against him has had a really significant effect. So a tremendous question, I think, is what about all the other hundreds or even thousands of leaders in the United States, but particularly around the world, who are regularly and successfully inciting violence online? I think I should stop there.
No, thank you for that, Susan. I think so. We have 11 minutes now for some Q&A, and I will tell you there are many questions. I appreciate the folks behind the scenes who are trying to curate those. What I recommend is I'll throw a question out. Whoever wants to answer, please do. Limit maybe the answer to 45 seconds if possible, just so that we can get through as many questions as possible. So the first question is, at what point should private companies like Facebook et al. Be treated as public utilities like telephone companies? If they are so classified, what would be the consequences? Anybody want to take that one? Just jump in, go ahead. Lauren, were you gonna jump, or Susan, go ahead.
Susan goes first and then I'll jump in.
The argument is, and that was a way in which the platforms defended Section 230 and their freedom from what we call intermediary liability. It's basically, we're the water company. We just build the pipes. We're not doing the water. We're not putting in the water. That's all of you. And it's not our responsibility. Thank us for providing the pipes or the wires or whatever is the infrastructure. It is not a ludicrous argument, but that would be basically its consequence.
Just to quickly jump in very briefly, I certainly agree exactly with what Susan was saying, and also want to note that there's really dynamic features for each platform. So while some platforms might function more like pipes, if there's one-to-one messaging, other features within a platform or other platforms might function more as, public message boards, might function more as places that ought to be public places of public accommodation. Facebook is amplifying and recommending content. So is Twitter. So is Snap. And so to the extent that somebody or a platform is engaging with in that way with content, maybe it's more than pipe. So I think that we have to just break down which type of platform we're talking about.
Thank you both. The next question is, what is the recommended action a local government should take when individuals are using slurs against others, presumably online, some who are elected, some who are elected or public officials? Is there different recommendations for non-elected residents doing the same?
I've talked a lot, right up my alley. I won't answer any more questions after this, although I see the questions are fantastic, which is very tantalizing. Paradoxically, in the land of the First Amendment, which is the law that protects speech more than any other anywhere in the world, we in the United States have rather powerful mechanisms of informal speech regulation. Shaming is sometimes, unfortunately, very effective, particularly online. You don't have a legal remedy. You can't sue somebody or prosecute them for using slurs, since using slurs is a right actually protected by the First Amendment. I speak of the public sphere offline. So in that case, I would suggest that you, in a civil way, make it known that this language has been used and oppose it in a civil, open way. If the language is used online, then you can flag it, as the Silicon Valley lingo goes. You can report it to a platform if you think that the use of that slur violates the platform's rules. And a true slur by now does violate the rules of most of the platforms, if used in a way intended to hurt somebody. Of course, if you're reporting someone else's use of a slur, that shouldn't violate the platform rules.
Thank you, Susan. Next question is, can you speak about what a comprehensive framework for policymakers or platforms to take meaningful action to decrease online hate and extremism? I think, Lauren, I think that might be good for you, others as well, in light of the repair plan.
Absolutely. Thanks, Oren. The question's great because it gets at a really important term, comprehensive framework. We've talked about so many different aspects of the issues around online hate and extremism. And we've even touched on a couple that we haven't dug into, which is, antitrust and anti-competitive marketplaces and power, and there's so many more. And so it's incredibly important that we approach this issue to decrease online hate and extremism from a multi-pronged manner. And ADL released our plan, the repair plan, wherein each letter of the term repair stands for a different priority that we believe policymakers and platforms should take, whether it's reframing or rethinking regulation, whether it's pushing on enforcement at scale that's equitable and that's meaningful, because a policy is only as good as its enforcement, whether it's putting people over profit, so rethinking the way that the business model encourages and optimizes for platforms to serve up sometimes even the most corrosive content, because that's what's going to keep somebody on the platform longer. There's a lot of different ways to look at the issue, and also parsing out, like we mentioned earlier, what type of platform or service are we talking about? And in light of what they provide, how might they be regulated, or how might there be oversight or accountability? So really parsing it out, looking at things from a multi-pronged manner. And please, I encourage everybody to look at our repair plan. We're really excited to get to work as we continue to do so with policy and lawmakers.
Thanks, Lauren. I think this last question is a good one for everyone. Is there anything that you are hopeful about? And I actually think it's important to end some of these conversations with a little bit of hope. And so if we can all just go around and maybe give a minute on that. Graeme, can I start with you for offering some hope for us?
Yeah, my reason for hope relates to what I said earlier about a process of education, of self-education that we have as citizens, that we are just beginning when it comes to these platforms. I think that there was a period when a lot of people thought Facebook was the Associated Press, like the Facebook was the New York Times. And if that's what you thought, then of course you'd be vulnerable to a lot of the extremism, weirdness, abuses that happen on social media. And now we understand it's a different thing. There is this process of learning, and it just takes a while with the new technology. People think that it's something that is harmless, think that it's something that's not addictive. And you know, they think it's like their morning coffee, and it turns out to be maybe a little bit more like crack cocaine, and in the sense that it's not a great thing to form a habit with, and very few people can manage it in an intense habit of it for very long. So I think the most hopeful thing for me is that I am part of a generation that didn't grow up with Facebook, and it's taken me some time to figure out how to use it responsibly. There is a generation that has grown up with it, and there are maladies associated with growing up with it, but there's also a process of education where as more people become digital natives and become more social media natives and aware of what these dangers are, the space will change, and there will be a better understanding of how to integrate the social media platforms into a healthy political sphere. Right now, we're in the hardest moment in that transition, and as time goes by, people will, I think, get better at it.
Thank you, Graeme. Lauren, any hope from you?
Sure. Just building on what Graeme mentioned, I think that we are at an inflection point. Educators and policymakers and communities are better understanding the impact of the digital world and the way that it integrates with our lives. So I think that we are going to start to see increased education, increased conversation, hopefully increased resourcing for research so that we can stay ahead of the curve this time, learning from this new, not so new era that we're in, and also for lawmakers to help us just put some more guardrails into this pretty open space that is ultimately harming some individuals. We want to make sure that those folks are protected.
Thank you, Lauren. And Susan, take us home with some hope.
I find that pretty easy. First of all, I completely agree with what Graeme and Lauren have said. There's a really interesting analogy, I think, between the internet and cars. When the automobile was new, it was a toy of the elite, and extremely quickly it became a tool for everyday life that almost everybody either owned or wanted to own. Same thing has happened with the internet. Cars killed a spectacular number of pedestrians in their early decades. Why? There were no streetlights, there were no driver's licenses, there were no seat belts, there were, et cetera, et cetera. We gradually, over many decades, found lots of different ways of taking this very dangerous but useful thing and incorporating it into daily life. Then I have two more quick points. One, hatred is nothing new. On the contrary, if you think about all the human beings who have ever lived, I would be willing to bet you that the majority of them have been taught to hate and fear another group of people. What is new is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are around the world actively opposed to hatred and trying to find ways of undermining it, to prevent it from being taught or to get people to unlearn it. My colleague Kathy Berger wrote a fantastic ethnographic study of a group of more than 100,000 people in more than a dozen countries who are collectively responding to hatred online. It's a very interesting experiment. It's called I Am Here in the relevant language of each of the countries. And then I'll very quickly finish with a third point, which is a kind of a corollary of what Graeme said about this moment in which we are very unpleasantly and uncomfortably learning something that will eventually be really useful. When somebody posts something offensive online, let's just to take an example, let's say it's a rape joke, a misogynist joke. A guy who posts that maybe 30 years ago would have said it to a group of other men known to him, and he could predict their reaction. Now, if he puts it on Facebook, sooner or later, some darn woman or somebody else who sympathizes with women will see that and be offended and report it to Facebook and complain. And that's conflict, but it's salutary conflict, because what is happening is that the original person is speaking inside his own normative community, but the communication, thanks to social media, is jumping over the wall where someone else is seeing it and then holding the original person to account according to a different set of norms. So these collisions among people who otherwise wouldn't have listened to each other's private conversations and internal thoughts are painful, but in the long run, I think very useful and salutary.
Susan, Graeme, Lauren, thank you so much for making the time, for sharing your perspectives and insights on this topic. I get some hope out of knowing that there are, people, really thoughtful people who are spending their time studying this, trying to make an impact, trying to educate people about that. And I know that's a requirement if the bad days that we're in now are going to get to that place that Graeme said, where things will be better. So again, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to sign off. Be well.